Okay, this is Institutions and Policy, and I ran Objective 2 about the legislative, executive, and judicial branches, the more traditional aspects of any government. Last objective, we took a look at the religious side of the Iranian theocracy, and now we're going to take a look at the more fundamental, basic branches of government side. Now, what you see before you is the original meleis, the original legislative building, as established by the Constitution of 1906. Now, the original meleis had to go through a series of growing pains. It was really Iran's first experience with democracy in any particular way, and therefore they had to kind of figure out what to do. That wasn't always easy. They had dictators, of course, the Pahlavi Shahs, that made it very difficult for them, and they had some difficulty after 1989 with some reforms that weakened their power a bit. But nonetheless, they still remained a prominent part of the Iranian theocracy. Now, this is the meleis today. If you take a look at it, it's generally regarded to be a unicameral legislature, which means a one-house legislature as opposed to a bicameral, which is a two-house. But some people have argued that it actually is a two-house legislature because of the Assembly of Religious Experts that we studied in Objective 1. Now, if you take a look at A1A on there, you'll see that it says the Assembly of Religious Experts has functioned as an upper house since 1989, in the sense those reforms that weaken the meleis a bit. Now, both offices, the Assembly of Religious Experts and also the meleis, are directly elected positions, and you can't really technically say the Assembly of Religious Experts is part of the branches of government, but realistically you could argue that it is. Now, the meleis today has 290 seats, each one of them elected by the old single-member district or first-past-the-post system. There does not appear to be any proportional representation at all in the Iranian legislature. One really interesting point has to do with their history in the 2000 and 2004 elections. In 2000, a series of reform parties formed a coalition called the Cordad Front and won 80% of the vote in the 2000 election. Now, that meant that the meleis was filled with reformers, and a lot of people thought that the conservatives, the traditional people who wanted the old style of doing things, were going to be shut out. Well, in 2004, that all changed. The Guardian Council stepped in, and since they have the power to decide who gets to run in elections, they banned a series of reformist candidates, and therefore left only conservatives to run. So after 2004, the conservatives in Iran, the clerics, the traditional people, got control of the meleis again, and it's basically been that way ever since. If you would, take a look at letter AC, and you'll see the powers that the meleis currently has, and those powers are very familiar, very similar to powers that other legislatures in other nations have, but I want you to take a look at C3, where they can appoint 6 members to the Guardian Council. There's only 12 members on the Guardian Council to begin with now, and when the meleis can appoint 6 of them, that gives them a pretty significant amount of power. The Guardian Council is one of the most powerful parts of the juris guardianship. The second major part of the branches of government in Iran would be the executive, and this is Hassan Rouhani, who is the current president of Iran as of 2013. Now, Iran is not considered a presidential system, so the head of the executive branch in this case doesn't have the same authority as presidents in a lot of other countries do. But they are considered the highest symbol of democracy. Now, again, to clarify that the executive is the head of government in Iran. And in most countries, that would mean he's in charge of the day-to-day operations of government, which he is. But you have to remember, even though he's technically considered a co-executive, as you see in 2A, along with the supreme leader, he's really the highest government official after the supreme leader. In most other countries, the president would have a little more power than this president does, but Iran is a theocracy, and because of that, the supreme leader has most of the power just due to his role in Islam and how important Islam is. So while he's considered the co-executive with the Supreme Leader, he's really kind of 1A behind the Supreme Leader in terms of who has more power. Nonetheless, he is looked up to and respected as the head of government in Iran, the ultimate symbol of democracy in Iran. And the president is also respected because it's usually a cleric of some sort, so they have that religious tie that people in Iran find so important. Only of all the 6 presidents that have been in place since the Islamic Republic formed in 1979, only one was not a cleric, and he was kicked out for criticizing the regime as a dictatorship. The Supreme Leader had enough of that and dismissed him immediately, and the rest of them have been clerics since that time. If you take a look at A2C, you'll see there that the qualifications for president are fairly similar to the U.S. president. They're directly elected by the people every 4 years. They do have a 2-term limit, just like the U.S. president does. A difference is the religious qualification. Iranian presidents must be Shiites, but if you take a look at 2D and look at the powers that the president has, you'll notice that they're very similar to those of the United States president as well. Like the U.S. president, the Iranian president's also in charge of a group of advisors known as his cabinet. In the United States, we would call them secretaries of the Treasury or Secretary of Defense, whatever the case may be. In Iran, they're called ministers, the Minister of Defense. But they serve a lot of the same functions, initiating new laws, looking at the budget, basically the day-to-day governing operations. If you take a look at letter A to F regarding the Iranian bureaucracy, you'll also see that that's relatively similar to the United States as well, with a lot of agencies that exist. It's actually big, like the U.S. bureaucracy. It's doubled since 1979. Unlike the U.S., it's dominated by the clergy, just like the other Iranian branches of government are. But again, they have very similar agencies to what you might find in the United States. Taking a look at A2H here regarding the Iranian military, you'll notice on the outline there that it's fairly substantial. It's the 8th largest military in the world at the current time, approximately 540,000 troops, although I think that's grown some since the printing of this information. And they're very interesting. They're part of the executive branch of the Iranian government, and you would think that the Iranian president would be the commander-in-chief of all military forces, just like the U.S. president is. But as you can imagine, there's only one person higher than the Iranian president, and that is the Supreme Leader. And it's the Supreme Leader who is the commander-in-chief of Iranian military forces. There are many facets to the military if you take a look at the list under letter H. First, it would be the Revolutionary Guards. Now, the Revolutionary Guards are primarily charged with defending the government, and therefore are considered the elites of the Iranian military. Commanders, like the regular army, are appointed by the Supreme Leader, and their primary job is to protect the government itself, not necessarily the borders, but the government. The defense of Iranian borders falls to the hands of the regular army. Again, the regular army leaders are appointed by the Supreme Leader. Another part of the Iranian military is their version of the National Guard, or the citizen militia, known as the Basij, which is number 4 on the list there. The Basij is a word that means mass mobilization in Persian. And it basically goes back to the days of Ayatollah Khomeini, who wanted civilian volunteers to go to the war front in the Iran-Iraq war. Overall, they're pretty loosely organized, much like the National Guard militia movements or citizen militias in the United States. One relatively scary aspect about the Iranian military has been their capability for long-range missiles. They've been extremely secretive about this, although one thing is pretty clear: the Revolutionary Guard seems to have a pretty significant influence. The Revolutionary Guard is becoming more and more independent as things go. They take an active role in policy making. In fact, a number of former members of the Revolutionary Guard are legislators in the melees right now, and they control a lot of the media outlets. So their role in the nuclear program is a little unnerving when you consider how strong they already are. Taking a look at A3, the final branch of government we want to take a look at here is the judicial branch. Now, the judicial branch has a Chief Justice who is a cleric and must have full knowledge of Sharia, or the Islamic law. And today that's this guy, Sadek Larijani. Sadek Larijani. Again, pardon me for that. But the Chief Justice is appointed by the Supreme Leader for a 5-year term and does what most Chief Justices would do in terms of managing the judiciary. The one thing that is interesting about the Iranian Supreme Court is the fact that despite their clerics, they do not have the final say in the interpretation of law, even though Sharia is very important to them. As you can imagine, the Supreme Leader, the Guardian Council, and the Assembly of Religious Experts have the final say. So please circle that under 3C. The Iranian judiciary does have judicial review, but it's not independent of religion like it is in the United States. In the United States, they would just interpret the Constitution. In Iran, it's strictly done by interpreting Islamic law, not necessarily the Constitution of 1979. That's a big difference between Iran and the U.S. Now, taking a look at letter E, Sharia does make up one part of Islamic law that supersedes all other types of law. So it's the most important one. And Sharia is the basic foundation of Islam, derived from Allah, according to the Muslims. And in Sharia, they're all considered to be brothers and sisters with the same moral values. The most important responsibility the government has is to make sure that Sharia is being followed. Now, Sharia at times can be pretty harsh. This is a public thrashing of someone who has violated Sharia law, and I'm not going to show you some of the more gruesome slides of public stonings or anything like that. The other part of Iranian law is the Qanon, which is man-made regular code law. It has no sacred basis to it, and that's just the basic law that people will follow that doesn't really have to do with Sharia religion, simpler laws. The biggest responsibility that the Malays has is to not pass a law that would violate Sharia in any particular way. Okay, that's a basic look at the Iranian branches of government.